Okay, colleagues, so we're going to continue now with the wonderful article by David Brink from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So I should maybe follow up on a couple of things I said, right? So I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but still, these questions of egoism, I think, are important for us, especially in terms of, potential criticism of, Marxist critique of ideology, right? And I want to say that in a certain important respect, I feel that meta-ethically, right, from the standpoint of axiology, theory of value, the criterion of action has to be immanent. Reasons long and complicated, partly having to do with philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, right? But I feel that the criterion has to be immanent criterion of goodness, of right and wrong, right? And that's why I'm fine. I think I think I'm generally okay when somebody like Mill says that, look, I have other regarding desires, like I care about other human beings. I don't want other people to suffer, or I don't want animals to suffer, or let's say I love my children and therefore I want to do good things to my children. I'm fine with that. But the criterion has to be immanent. I decide. You cannot build a government, or you should not build a government on the assumption of altruism of the rulers. Let's put it that way. Now, obviously, as I mentioned in the previous section, I think that some degree of pro-sociality is necessary, right? Human beings need to be motivated to some extent to follow, to broadly speaking, exhibit pro-social behavior. But this cannot be the sole or the only or the main motivation. We need to have checks and balances, right? So can't assume rulers complete, let's say, altruism. Need checks and balances. Now, having said that, yeah, we do want to assume some altruism, but again, I want to say some egoistic altruism. So we want to egoistic altruism, right? This idea that human beings do good to other people because they feel good themselves because of doing that, right? How, again, compare this to Marx, who says that in communism there is no competition between egoism and altruism. Marx very explicitly says in the German ideology that in communism people are not asked to sacrifice themselves for the good of the whole, right? And Rousseau, his notions of general will, I think, apply here as well. Let's talk about this more in the seminar. Again, I keep emphasizing how in this course, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Mill, Hegel, and Marx, these six philosophers, they clarify important points in each other. Okay. So let's continue. So Mill disagrees with the radicals about the nature of happiness. Now this is more interesting and more important. And with this, I'm totally on this issue. I'm totally with Mill. And again, in my reading of Marx and in my reading of Nietzsche, I rely mostly on Mill's intuition about higher and lower pleasures. We're going to talk about them in a second. So Mill never abandons the utilitarian tradition, but he modifies their ideas about happiness in important respects. So So when we talk about utilitarianism, we have this quote. So the creed, which accepts as the foundation of morals utility or the greatest happiness principle, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Mill, so here Mill explicitly endorses the greatest happiness principle, right? Holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong in proportion as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And by happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain, by unhappiness, pain and privation of pleasure. This famous passage is sometimes called the Proportionality Doctrine, or I think in our other readings it's referred to as the Proportionality Criterion. Proportionality Criterion. So actions are good in proportion in which they increase happiness. This sounds like Bentham, and indeed, so the first sentence appears to endorse utilitarianism, while the second phrase appears to endorse a hedonistic conception of utilitarianism. Okay, maybe. Again, hedonism implies the mental state of pleasure. It's the only thing that has intrinsic value, and all the mental and the mental state of pain is the only one that has intrinsic evil, right? All other things have only extrinsic value. They have value just insofar as they bring about immediately or immediately or directly, right? Intrinsic value or disvalue. So this, it would follow from this that presumably we're only talking about quantity of pleasure, right? And the quantity is then a function of a number of pleasures, their intensity, and their duration, right? So this is all important, like a quantitative conception of utilitarianism. This would mean that one kind of activity or pursuit is intrinsically no better than another. If we correctly value one more than another, it must be because the first produces more numerous, intense, or durable pleasures than the others, right? And Mill worries that some will reject hedonism as the value of happiness fit only for the swine. Yeah. So utilitarianism as the philosophy for the swine. And it's a phrase from Carlyle, maybe. So it's an important, I forget. Mill devotes portions of his work to try to defend utilitarianism from this charge. In particular, Mill worries that opponents will assume that utilitarianism favors sensual or voluptuous pursuits. And yes, so very famously, Bentham says that because pleasures only differ in number, intensity, and duration, Pushpin, in principle, could be as good as poetry. Pushpin is an obscure game. You can try to find it on the web. It's I think it also involves a gambling element. But it's supposed to be a very stupid, very unrefined, very simplistic game, and maybe potentially with elements of gambling, so something unsavory there, right? And compare this to poetry. This sounds like a strange comparison, but true to this quantitative version of utilitarianism, Bentham insists that, in principle, Pushpin can be as good as poetry, an important phrase that we need to know. So Mill attempts to reassure readers that utilitarians can and will defend superiority of higher pleasures. So, in fact, I'm not sure if the text is going to give us this quote, but Mill says that if somebody says that utilitarianism is a philosophy for the swine, they are underestimating the kinds of pleasures that human beings are capable of. Humans are not just capable of pleasures of the swine. This is Mill's basic defense. And again, I want to say, broadly speaking, again, when Nietzsche talks about affirmation of life, what is he talking about, right? The ideal of Goethe. So humans are capable of higher pleasures, pleasures that other than pleasures of the swine, of pleasures other than pleasures of the swine. Anyway, so Mill begins by noting, with fairly obvious reference to Bentham, that hedonists can defend higher pursuits as extrinsically superior on the grounds that they produce more pleasure, right? So we're talking about more pleasure. This would be a quantitative account, that higher pleasures simply quantitatively give you more pleasure. While Mill thinks that a Benthamite can defend the extrinsic superiority of higher pleasure, he's not content with his defense of their superiority. Mill insists that the greater value of intellectual pleasures can and should be put on a more secure footing. Greater value. So not just quantity, So quantity, but not just quantity. That's what it seems. But quantity as well, it seems. Again, obviously we'll talk about this example. It's better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Presumably, it is more pleasant to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. It is presumably more pleasant to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. We'll talk about this. Yeah. So Mill explains that higher pleasures and links them with a preference of the competent judge. So again, this is a problematic notion. Competent judge, and especially the idea that most people, many people, not all people are competent judges. Yes. So if I'm asked what I mean, so this is a quote from from Bentham. Sorry, from Mill. If I'm asked what I mean by difference in quality of pleasure, so that's a problem for utilitarian considerations. What do you mean quality? How are we supposed to then calculate? Right. So this is a problem. Let me signal. Introducing qualitative distinctions is a problem. Now, one way to solve this problem is to say that it's quantity, but not just quantity. So it's quality, but greater quality translates into greater quantity also to some extent. Translates into greater quantity with a question mark, because this is a debatable problem, potentially an unsolved problem. So what makes one pleasure more valuable than another, merely as a pleasure, except it being greater in amount? But there's one possible answer. So not just greater in amount, but there's another possible answer, right? And this other possible answer is that so those who are competently acquainted with both, let's say two different pleasures. So somebody who's competently acquainted with two different pleasures places so far above the other. You see, this is, again, you will see this in the article by Paul Kelly, in Boucher and Kelly, that one possible way to solve this is just to say that, yeah, in principle, you can compare higher pleasures and lower pleasures in quantity. You can compare them in quantity. But in quantity, the higher pleasures are so far above the other that any competent judge would prefer it, even though knowing it to be attained with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity, would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure. Wow. So they, like, in principle, you can try to compare them quantitatively, but the idea is that quantitatively, lower pleasure will never be able to substitute for higher pleasure quantitatively. Yes. Indeed, superior inequality so that far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison of small account. So enjoyment of a higher pleasure in quality so far outweighs quantity as to render it in comparison of small account, that we don't have to, even look at the quantity, because the quality is just so different. Again. I think that this can be so it's a problem, but I feel that this is a problem that can be solved by some appropriate notion of quantification. Okay? Why do we need to solve it? Because utilitarianism rests on the notion of comparing pleasures. And, when we compare pleasures, some notion of quantification is important. Anyway, indeed, Mill seems to claim here not just that higher pleasures are intrinsically more valuable, but then they're discontinuously better. So, incalculably better. Okay. This certainly goes beyond Bentham. This is beyond Bentham. So if you want, this is Mill's criticism of Bentham. In fact, it is not clear that Mill's higher pleasures doctrine is even consistent with hedonism. So that's the root of the problem. I told you. It's a problem, so here we run into the problem. Mill's position here is hard to pin down. So it's difficult to pin down. Mill doesn't explain himself very well. In part because Mill uses the term pleasure sometimes to refer to certain kinds of mental state or sensation, and at other times to refer to non-mental items such as actions, activities, and pursuits. Okay. That do or can cause pleasurable mental states. And an example, consider the way in which someone might say that surfing was her highest pleasure. We might call the A-type subjective pleasures and B-type objective pleasures. Okay, I'm not sure if we need this, but let's continue. What is unclear is whether Mill's higher pleasures are subjective pleasures or objective pleasures. His discussion concerns activities that employ our higher faculties. What's unclear is whether higher pleasures refer to mental states or sensations. Okay, whatever. Let's just continue. I am not sure that we honestly need this. Okay, it might seem clear that we should interpret higher pleasures as subjective pleasures. After all, Mill just told us that he's a hedonist about happiness. The radicals might not have always been clear about the kind of mental state or sensation, but it seems clear that they conceive of it as some kind of mental state or sensation. Some, like Bentham, appear to conceive of pleasure as a sensation with distinctive kind of qualitative feel. Yeah, I feel that we should talk. We must talk, even for Mill. We must talk about sensations, because again, if you go back to Epicurean roots of in this notion of immanent criterion that I've been talking about previously, we need to have epistemic access. Like a person judges, we talk about competent judges, but I feel competent judges judge an internal subjective sensation. So I feel we must talk about an internal subjective sensation. Let me add this here. Internal subjective sensation. Right. This is what the competent judges are judging about. Again, at least on my reading. Others, perhaps of despairing of finding qualia common to all disparate kinds of pleasures, tend to understand pleasures functionally as mental states or sensations. James Mill. Wow. Insofar as Mill does discuss subjective pleasure, he is not clear which of these conceptions he favors. Nonetheless, it may seem natural to assume that as a hedonist he conceives of pleasures as subjective pleasures. Again, this is what I told you. This is my judgment. According to this interpretation, Mill is focusing on pleasurable sensations and then distinguishing higher and lower pleasures by reference to their causes. Higher pleasures are pleasures caused by the exercise of our higher faculties. Higher pleasures are pleasures caused by the exercise of our higher faculties. How do you know which faculties are higher? Well, you need to fall back on the subjective sensation. Whereas lower pleasures are pleasures caused by exercise of our lower capacities. But this interpretation is problematic. One concern is raised by Sidgwick. Hedonism is committed to the idea that one pleasure is better than another because it is more pleasurable. Yeah. And again, I feel, I'm not sure if Mill thought this through completely, but Mill must, I'm always assuming that the philosopher is consistent. So I would agree with this formulation. One pleasure is better than another because it is more pleasurable. So it is more pleasant to be a Socrates dissatisfied. More pleasant, more subjectively pleasant to be a Socrates dissatisfied. So Socrates is, feels subjectively happier than a fool or than a pig. Again, this is my interpretation of this problem. Let's continue. Yeah, this sounds like a quantitative relation. So I wanna say that at the end of the day, I want to try to reconcile Mill in terms of some kind of quantitative relation. If higher pleasures are better, how can this be squared with hedonism? But not just but not because. I would say not just because they involve greater quantity of pleasure. Or you see, again, I'm trying to interpret Mill against maybe the latter, because I want to say that higher pleasures have to quantitatively be better than lower pleasures as well. And I feel that, again, if we look back to these to these quotes, again, Mill thinks that Bentham can defend the extrinsic superiority. He is not contented with the defense. So higher pleasures. Well, anyway, it's like I feel that we can try to substantiate this with reference to Mill. Anyway, let's go back. One answer is that Mill thinks that there are two factors affecting the magnitude of pleasure. Its quantity, as determined by intensity and duration, and its quality or kind. On this proposal, one pleasure can be greater than another independently of its quantity by virtue of its quality. Maybe. Okay, this is a genuinely complicated topic. So again, as always, let me add question marks to signal that this is a problematic issue. Let's talk about this maybe in the seminar. We can distinguish among pleasures between those that are caused by exercise of our higher faculties, or caused by lower faculties. Why should this difference affect the pleasurableness of the state? If Mill holds a preference or a functional conception of pleasure, according to which pleasures are mental states, then perhaps he could claim that pleasures categorically preferred by competent judges are more pleasurable pleasures. Again, this sounds reasonable to me. However, Mill says that competent judges have this preference for the higher pleasure, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater degree of discontent. Again, I feel that Mill is just using sloppy language. So let's try this. Sloppy language on Mill's part. Yeah. So, even if we can distinguish higher and lower pleasures according to their causes, it remains unclear how the hedonist is to explain higher pleasures are intrinsically more pleasurable. Again, okay, we could get lost in this, but I feel that at the end of the day, my point about Socrates preferring to be Socrates rather than preferring to be a fool, this position still stands. So even though Mill, his language may be unclear, his conclusion is clear enough. And I think, I hope, or I feel it's clear enough for political purposes. Okay. So a related concern is what do we do with Mill's contrast between happiness and contentment, or satisfaction, right? So what does it mean to say, Socrates dissatisfied, fool satisfied? Yeah. Again, it seems to me that Mill is just using sloppy language. Mill does not say that the preference of competent judges is for one kind of contentment or over another, right? Or that Socrates has more contentment than a pig or a fool by virtue of enjoying a different kind. Instead, he contrasts happiness and contentment and implies that Socrates is happier than a fool, even less contented. Again. My tentative solution is that sloppy language. Sloppy language, again. I would fall back on this notion. With a question mark, obviously. Yeah, so another problem is that Mill frequently understands higher pleasures as objective pleasures. So first, we have independent evidence that Mill sometimes uses the word pleasure to refer to objective pleasures. For instance, second part of the proof, he counts music, virtue, and health as pleasures. Again, I would prefer subjective reading. I feel again, this is sloppy language. Sloppy language. It should be subjective all the way, with a question mark. When Mill introduces higher pleasures, he's clearly discussing, among other things, intellectual pursuits and activities. He claims to be arguing that the quantitative hedonist finds extrinsically more valuable is also intrinsically more valuable. Yeah. Again. I feel that maybe we're, I would prefer to fall back on sloppy language and just skip this discussion. Because it seems to me, again, this would be enough for political purposes. So unquestionable fact. Yeah. So this is Mill's quotation. It is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of. This is a much more interesting topic of discussion for me, I would say, right? This idea of how Mill is saying that in principle, everybody is capable of higher pleasures. However, most people, and again, this is an important point of contact between Marx and Mill, is that Mill is going to say most people cannot, they can experience higher pleasures in principle, but they cannot experience higher pleasures in reality because capitalism, he doesn't say capitalism, because he says, society breaks people. They work too hard. They lose the capacity. As let's say, as flowers planted not in a fertile soil, but flowers planted in the desert, they wither away. Our capacity for higher pleasures withers away. Yeah. Anyway. So, okay, insofar as we still talk about these objective pleasures, this all seems anti-hedonistic for two reasons. First, he claims that intellectual pursuits have value out of proportion And second, he claims that those activities are intrinsically more valuable. Yeah, again. I'm sorry, because I feel that maybe for moral philosophy this is more important, but for political philosophy, I think we can just skip this. Again, I would insist on subjectivist, quantitative reading of Mill, of this. So I would insist on subjectivist, quantitative reading of Mill, that the criterion of rightness and wrongness is intrinsic. Bach prefers to write music as opposed to, I don't know, eating pastry because it is more pleasurable. Anyway, whichever way we read Mill's higher pleasure doctrine, it's hard to square doctrine with hedonism traditionally formulated. This apparent inconsistency is noted by many. Okay, so there's Sidgwick, then there's Green. Okay, again, we talk about competent judges. Yeah, this problematic notion of dignity, which I would prefer maybe not to go into. To see Green's point, think of competent judges as demigods. You see, I would prefer to not talk about competent judges as demigods. I think, again, what Mill is saying at the end of the day is that I think what Mill is doing is he's proposing a counterfactual. Mill is proposing a counterfactual. He says, if you look at people who today, obviously, let's say people who are in distress or whatever, people who prefer junk food or people who prefer drugs like, I don't know, heroin or opium, the reason, let's not use this heroin, let's say junk food or alcohol or stupid television, whatever, right? That those people are simply not given the right opportunity to blossom by society. If everybody had access, then everybody, or as Mill says, almost everybody. Is this important? Well, politically, it's an important political concession, because for politics to work, we need enough of consensus, and that's the whole point. Everybody, or almost everybody meaning that it doesn't really threaten the consensus, the political consensus. Almost everybody would prefer, first of all, would agree on what higher pleasures are, and would, as a matter of fact, prefer them. And the reason why we don't do this is, again, say hi to Marx. It's a problem with the arrangement of our social system. This is my reading. And again, Mill talks about these specific things. He talks about how capacity for higher pleasures is a tender plant, which, if not cultivated, can just wither away. And it's not people's fault. It is a problem with our institutions and the arrangement of our society. I would actually prefer if the article talked about that. But let's continue. So the next important idea, of course, is perfectionism, right? So that, talking about higher pleasures leads to this perfectionism about happiness. And by the way, notice, so we are supposedly talking about Mill as this champion of negative liberty. Do you see much negative liberty in this? I don't, honestly. In a sense that, Mill, again, especially I talked about this tender plant, cultivation of higher pleasures, right? Society needs to enable us, right? Society needs to enable us. And that's exactly the notion of positive freedom or positive liberty. It's kind of Isaiah Berlin, of course, introduces some caveats. Like when he writes with caveats, right? He doesn't write. It's a lecture, really, right? The two concepts of liberty, but Mill is definitely, when you read Mill is, it's wrong to construe Mill as this unabashed champion of of negative liberty without reserve. Anyway, yes. So we talk about perfectionism. Yes. Yeah. So on liberty, we have this very important concept. So Mill talks about. He says he's not going to talk about abstract rights. So Mill, like Hobbes, like Hume, like so many others, does not believe in abstract rights. But his ultimate appeal is going to be utility. I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions, but it must be utility in the large sense, grounded on the permanent interest of man as a progressive being. This is a super important phrase. It's so important. Let me try to signal it as much as I can. Millions, learn this by heart, okay? Utility in the largest sense of the word, grounded on the permanent interest of man as a progressive being. Utility in the largest sense of the word, grounded on permanent interest of man as a progressive being. And you see, this is why I want this to be an intrinsic criterion. Because, this post factum counterfactual, that we can all agree that there is such a thing as a permanent interest of man as a progressive being. There needs to be an internal criterion in order for us to be able to talk about that. Okay, so... yes, categorical preference. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates satisfied than a fool satisfied. Talked about this already. Okay, self-examination, practical deliberation. Okay, another quote from Mill. Let's see what we have here. He who lets the world, or his own portion of it, choose his plan of life for him has no need of any other faculty than ape-like one of imitation. He who chooses his plan for himself enjoys all his faculties. So again, there's this very important defense of autonomy in Mill. And again, I want to say that autonomy is important partly because criterion is intrinsic. Criterion is immanent. We have this immanent criterion. I have to decide for myself. And in principle, only I can decide for myself what is good. He must use observation to see, reasoning and judgment to foresee, activity to gather materials for decision, etc., etc. These qualities he requires and exercises exactly in proportion. It's possible that he might be guided. Yes, but still, again, what will be his comparative worth as a human being if a person does not decide for themselves? And again, we can maybe compare this to Aristotle. And again, well, this is why I like to talk about Aristotle and maybe a little bit about Epicurus. Again, so Aristotle has this notion of eudaimonia. Again, this idea that we become happy when we exercise our highest capacities. This is what it takes to be properly human and properly happy. And again, in this sense, I think that Aristotle and Mill are on the same page, broadly speaking. Okay. Yeah, so then we have this question, why does this make us progressive being? So in his discussion of responsibility in the system of logic, Mill suggests that he thinks that humans are responsible agents, and this is what marks us as progressive beings. Maybe. Capacities for practical deliberation are necessary for responsibility. In particular, he claims that moral responsibility involves a kind of self-mastery or self-governance. And again, you have to understand, right? So if you start with utilitarian premises, you're open to all these strange questions, right? You can say, well, why I mean, if somebody just drugs me to death, wouldn't this make me happier, right? And Mill has this, maybe perfectionist ideal of human individuality, this quasi-Aristotelian rose in full bloom. Okay, one can deliberate about, yeah. Thus, if this is right, Mill can claim that possession and use of our deliberative capacities marks us as progressive being because they are, our happiness should reflect the sort of beings we are. Mill can argue that higher activities that exercise these deliberative capacities form the principal or most important ingredient in human happiness. Yes. Again. Okay. Reconciling the elements. Where exactly does this recognition of perfectionist elements in Mill conception leave us, right? So what is the conclusion? Any interpretation faces significant worries about Mill's inconsistency. Part of the problem is that Mill appeals to endorse three distinct conceptions of the good and happiness, right? So there's hedonism, pleasure is one and the only intrinsic good. Desire satisfaction, the one and only intrinsic good is the satisfaction of desire. And perfectionism, the exercise of one's higher capacities, is one and only intrinsic good. So, and again, I think we need to try to reconcile. And I feel that they may be reconciled, maybe. In my own head, okay? Okay, hedonism is apparently introduced, yes. Okay, so Mill identifies happiness and pleasure. In introducing the doctrine of higher pleasures, Mill appears to want to make some refinement within hedonism, but the higher pleasures doctrine appeals to the informed or idealized preferences of a competent judge and identifies higher pleasures with the objects of their preference. Moreover, Mill treats his appeal to the preferences of competent judges as final, but competent judges prefer higher activities, not just subjective pleasures caused by those activities. Well, I'm not sure. I think competent judges prefer activities precisely because of the subjective pleasure of those activities. So I would say not, but precisely because. Their preference is based on their sense of dignity inherent. Yeah, but I want to say sense of dignity also has to be this subjective feeling. I don't know. Moreover, in On Liberty and elsewhere, Mill embraces progressive conception of happiness in terms of reflexive self-examination and directive self-control. And again, I just feel that, again, Mill would have to say that counterfactually, if you tried to be a pig and be a fool and be a Socrates, you would freely choose to be a Socrates rather than a pig or a fool, because subjectively it just feels better. These are three distinct rival claims. Any reading must explain away the inconsistency at best. Whatever. We could reconcile hedonism or perfectionism with desire satisfaction if we treat the latter as meta-ethical claim about what makes things good. I don't like this solution because I think meta-ethically, Mill has to be committed to subjectivism. And again, we all are competent judges. That's the whole point, I think, of Mill's idea. But the dignity passage implies the preferences of competent judges are evidential rather than constitutive. Yeah, and I would say yes, they are evidential, not constitutive. So what is meant by evidential, not constitutive, is that the decision of competent judges provides evidence and not grounds. So competent judges are indicators, not deciders. Competent judges are indicators, not stipulators, not declarers, not decision makers, right? Not let's say they have no authority or something like that to decide, to decide, right? They simply indicate. And again, and the idea is that, the only thing that competent judges do is they, so to speak, they predict what you will feel like. It's like a parent telling to a child, like when you grow up, you will find, Beethoven more pleasant than popular music. It's a prediction. It's supposed to be a prediction, right? I feel. Indication, prediction, not decision. And so again, what I want to say is that all of this assumes a whole lot. These are very, very important. Not important, but these are numerous assumptions. It's a whole battery of assumptions about human nature. A whole battery of, I would say, personally, I would say, in my opinion, not unrealistic assumptions. about human nature. You know, I really, as a Marxist, I really don't like the fact that we spend so much time nitpicking the words. Whereas, again, I think the driving force of Mill's argument is that, again, people choose lower pleasures over higher because they simply do not have the capacity to choose higher pleasures. And again, like in my own experience, people who have the real opportunity in life, all or almost all invariably choose what I think Mill would agree are higher pleasures. And people who, in my experience, people I know personally, choose lower pleasures, do so because, again, capacity for higher pleasures is a tender plant and it's easily destroyed by overwork, lack of sleep, lack of resources, worrying about the political climate, etc., etc., etc. Okay, Marxist in me protests the way this article is set up. Okay. So, okay, the perfectionist reading offers one reconciliation of Mill's desperate claims. It says that happiness consists in the exercise of higher capacities, that the preferences of competent judges are evidential of superior value. Yes, evidential, I would agree with that. And that higher pleasures are objective pleasures. Okay, I'm not sure about this because I still feel that they have to be subjective pleasures. There is no doubt that Mill's initial formulation in terms of pleasure misleadingly leads us to expect greater continuity between his own brand of utilitarianism and the hedonistic utilitarianism of the radicals. However, this perfectionist interpretation seems to afford the most consistent reading of Mill's disparate claims about happiness. Maybe. Okay, we should probably, I could go on, but the next section is going to deal with something else, right? So we're finally going to talk about direct and indirect utilitarianism, and also these things such as act and rule utilitarianism, sanction utilitarianism. So let's take a break here, if nothing else, then for the purposes of ease of search and location. So, it's kind of difficult to read an article you don't necessarily agree with everything, right? So, but I don't know. I hope this is somewhat useful, at least, and maybe stimulating. The things are becoming clearer. Maybe go back to the text and reread Mill's own text. Anyway, colleagues, let's take a break now. Stay safe, take care, and I'll see you after the break. Somewhat useful, at least, and maybe stimulating. The things are becoming clearer. Maybe go back to the text and Mill's own text. Anyway, colleagues, let's take a break now.